So it was February of 1971, and I joined the temple at Sevenbury Place in London. And Prabhupada was coming in August. So Mukunda Prabhu, then now Mukunda Goswami, was a temple president, and he recognized that I had some clerical skills. So besides going out every day and chanting on Harinam and distributing Back to Godhead magazines, I also spent some time in the office every day. So preparing for Prabhupada's arrival, possibly because, again, I had some clerical skills, I was sent to a shop in London to pick up a dictation machine for Srila Prabhupada's translations. Now, the dictation machine, of course, is a machine itself, and then there's a microphone with an on-off button and then a coiled wire. So I picked up the machine, I brought it back to the temple. Prabhupada was at the temple by that time, and I gave it to his secretary. The next day I was called into Prabhupada's room. And I was, oh, what's going on? So I knocked on the door, entered, paid my obeisances. Prabhupada held up the microphone. He said, "It is useless." Oh my goodness. I received the microphone from Srila Prabhupada, ran, it was probably 20 minutes or so, to this shop, replaced the microphone, ran back to the temple, and gave it to Prabhupada's secretary. Perhaps it was Shyam Sundar. The next day I was called into Prabhupada's room. This time, however, he was holding the microphone and he was absolutely beaming. So I, Mr. Too Much Information, began to explain to Prabhupada that this and this and this is what was wrong, what were wrong with the previous microphone. And he stopped me. He said, "I do not want to know what was wrong with the other microphone. I'm simply happy that this one is working." So he taught me this lesson, that details and facts that I may find absolutely fascinating, if they don't really help the spiritual master in his mission, don't burden him with unnecessary information. Simply do your duty to the best of your ability, and that is how he will be pleased. A few days later, it was after the morning program, perhaps 9 or 10 o'clock in the morning, and just a few devotees and I were in the temple. Again, this was Sevenbury Place in London. And the curtains were open, and we were chanting before the deities. All of a sudden, Prabhupada walks in. We immediately fall flat. We get up. Prabhupada comes very, very close. There was a little guardrail, comes very, very close to Shri Shri Radha London Ishwara. He observes them. And then I said, with folded palms, I said, "Srila Prabhupada." I said, "Srila Prabhupada, do you like the way Lord Krishna is dressed?" He said, "He's very beautiful." Then he stood there observing the deities for a little longer. And then in my mind, I simply thought, "And Srila Prabhupada, what about Srimati Radharani?" He paused and he looked at me and he said, "Srimati Radharani is also very beautiful." So Prabhupada was demonstrating that although he appeared in human form, he had capabilities and consciousness and powers far beyond those of any mortal human being. On the way back to the London Temple on the same walk, Srila Prabhupada all of a sudden stopped. I was at the kind of the rear of the line. He turned around and looked at all of us. He could have been looking at me. And he asked the most unusual question. He said, "Why is it that one person will pay much more for the same object than other people?" Well, I was thinking, is this some kind of official policy question? So I began asking the older devotees. Prabhupada asked, and then I explained the question. No one had an answer. So then Prabhupada looked back at us all and he said, "Simply because someone wants to pay more than everyone else." So Prabhupada was demonstrating not only was he completely conversant in the science of Krishna consciousness, he had an in-depth understanding of human psychology, of business psychology, and of human nature. Srila Prabhupada was still in the London Temple in August of 1971, but because Hari Vilas had preached to me in Paris in the winter of 1970 and essentially had made me a devotee, he requested Shyam Sundar, I believe it was, to please send me back to Paris and join the yatra there, which I did. So that was in August of 71, and Prabhupada was still at the London Temple. So anyone who's lived in an ISKCON temple knows that there's a mission to carry out. There are people with conflicting points of view, although the aim is one. And it's not always all peace and love and flower and roses. There's, rambunctious behavior, there may be angry words and so forth. Hari Vilas was a very strong-willed person, very strong and convincing preacher, and he wanted things done his way, so sometimes some of us were not totally happy. Well, out of the blue, this tall, beautiful, long-haired, sattvic appearing couple dressed in dhoti and sari appeared from Laguna Beach. Now we thought they were devotees. It turns out I think they were probably more impersonalists. And they began kind of undermining Hari Vilas's authority by just preaching peace and love and saying we should take the sugar out of our diet. Well, perhaps there was some wisdom to that. At that time, we rented vans and we went on traveling Sankirtan to different parts of the south of France. And this couple had some mystic powers, and they convinced me and another young American brahmachari to go with them instead and to leave this passionate organization known as ISKCON. Now, mind you, we were still chanting 16 rounds and following the four regulative principles, but we had left the temple. This is another story, but we ended up on some kind of little fishing boat on the way to Africa, and then we came back, and I realized these people did not have the answer, that Prabhupada is where I belonged. So I had no money. I just had my sleeping bag and a little incense. So I spent several days sleeping in a park in Marseille, keeping body and soul together by selling incense. By that time in Paris, Bhagavan had arrived and had taken charge. So I called him collect and I said, Prabhu, I know this sounds presumptuous, but would you please send me train fare so I can come back and join the temple? And a few days later, the train fare did arrive, and I took an overnight train from Marseille to Paris and then to the temple at Fontenay-aux-Roses. Well, Prabhupada was arriving probably within 2 weeks. So not having had any facility, I had a little growth on my chin and on my head as well, and I shaved up and gradually felt more and more like a disciple of Prabhupada and a member of this wonderful society, ISKCON. Prabhupada was arriving, but I was still very filled with remorse for having left his mission. So at the time, the temple was located in Fontenay-aux-Roses, a suburb of Paris, in a actually very small house. And according to my recollection, the way that the front yard was arranged is that it was surrounded with hedges. So when Prabhupada arrived at the airport, there was nobody to greet him. Everyone was just busy preparing the temple for his arrival. And all of a sudden, Prabhupada entered this small yard, and because of the hedges, I and Prabhupada, or I should say Prabhupada and I, were alone. Well, I saw him and I fell flat on the ground, filled with remorse for having left his mission. When I got up, I was on my knees and I looked up, and Prabhupada's face was perhaps just 1 foot from mine, and he was looking at me with so much compassion. Now, I've heard other disciples say this a number of times, that there was that sense that Prabhupada knew everything about you. And I so had that feeling, that impression, that Prabhupada was aware that I had deviated from his mission, that I had come back, that I was filled with remorse, and that he totally forgave me. That was a lesson I will never forget. I was invited on a walk with Srila Prabhupada while he was in London, and this was August of 1971. And there weren't many devotees, perhaps 12 at most. So Prabhupada would walk down Bury Place and then go to Russell Square, I believe it was. So we were all just chanting quietly, following Prabhupada's example. And all of a sudden, young 22-year-old Jaya Jagadish sidles up to Jagadguru, Srila Prabhupada, and says, Srila Prabhupada, can Krishna sing? Prabhupada kept walking. He said, of course he can see. And I said, no, Srila Prabhupada, can Krishna sing? He stopped. He looked at me. He held up his hand. He said, he is the best singer. Well, never mind that the scripture we study every day is the song of God, the Bhagavad-gita. This was an obvious question, a childish question. But rather than dismissing this silly little question, Prabhupada not only gave a sublime answer, but in his answer he encouraged the questioning and answering process between disciple and spiritual master. Well, I had an experience with Prabhupada that I'm not particularly proud of, but it was a learning experience. This was at the temple in Fontenay-aux-Roses, outside of Paris, in August, I believe, of 1972. Prabhupada came down. It was a very, very small residence, basically. Prabhupada came down to the temple room in the part of the morning program, and he was seated in his Vyasasan, and we were all chanting very, very loudly, singing kirtan very, very loudly. And then, to my external consciousness, Prabhupada appeared to drift off. Well, I understand now, at least I understand hypothetically, that the pure devotee is not subject to the three modes of material nature. And what appears to me, a mundane material person, that someone is going to sleep, the pure devotee is going to sleep, no, he's not going to sleep in the way that you or I experience going to sleep. He is always deepening his connection with Krishna. Well, this speaks to my growing offensive nature to Srila Prabhupada. I shot him a dart of anger. Why are you sleeping? So Prabhupada simply gradually opened his eyes, started chanting kirtan with us again, but in a very, very undisturbed way. And I've heard other disciples describe qualities of Prabhupada or pastimes of Prabhupada in which events that would, big or small, that would cause great disturbance in most of us, Prabhupada remains totally undisturbed, be it a loud noise or some kind of threat. And so that event that, again, I am not proud of, but I did engage in, was another learning lesson for me, another lesson how Prabhupada was undisturbed by this flood of material consciousness that, because of his love for his spiritual master, he chose to be amidst and to gradually purify by his presence. Jaya